that we can ensure a society where we have equal rights, right? It's imperative, especially in this moment where we're thinking about what a post-pandemic recovery will look like. And a post-pandemic recovery must ensure status for all.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So then I'd like, Robert, can you give me your top two?
Top two would be provide pre-settlement services for international students. And my argument, my pushback against the response, we have 600,000 international students, not all of them are going to settle. There's a bit of a self-selection factor for settlement services. The ones who are going to be using settlement services or unemployment are the ones who are going to be very likely ones looking to remain in Canada. So you're going to, for international students who aren't particularly interested in settling long-term in Canada, who might be interested in going back to their home countries or moving to another country like the United States, I think, you know, if the concern there is funding for that, I wouldn't put that as a major concern, because again, there's a selection factor in that those who are likely to access service agencies that will help them find employment, improve their skills, are going to be the ones who are more likely to want to stay in Canada long term. And why don't we provide them some tools to do that right up front? That would be my major suggestion. The other one would be, again, just considering what does our funding model exactly look like for universities going forward. Have we to what extent do we provide more government funding, more external sources of funding for universities, so that we aren't and maybe to Mikhal's sort of larger point, what is the inelasticity of demand for spots at Canadian universities something that we really want to be relying on for to fund our university model?
Thank you, Robert. That was really good and brief. Hit the big points, so that's great. Yeah, what are you?
Yeah, just a couple of things, and I will try and be quick. In the first instance, for the record, the Canadian Chamber does have a resolution process. Resolutions are active for years, and state for the record, pre-COVID, we have policy resolutions related to international students. For example, asking for the removal of permit requirement for work integrated learning opportunities. We have a work permit, a resolution about qualifying international students for the Canadian Summer Jobs Program, as well as counting all time spent in Canada to citizenship eligibility, for what it's worth. I think my one recommendation for government going forward, and it doesn't apply to international students only, but immigration more broadly, is labor market analysis and trying to do this. And I'm going to drop this without being able to expand on it totally. And I know I'll probably take it on the chin for it. But, you know, I do take your point, Michaela, about economic growth. But I don't think that's only such a bad thing either. And I don't think economic growth and immigrant success are mutually exclusive. I would actually say they're related. And at the end of the day, everybody needs to have meaningful or gainful, you know, income, usually vis-a-vis employment. So I do think that's an important consideration. I do really think it's important to understand Kareem's point about this economic crisis and devastation, you know, and the havoc on the business community. And we would have said, you know, at a time that it's, you know, 90% of this country, 98% are small and medium-sized businesses. Let's take that into account. But this K-shaped, some people call it the recovery, we still call it the crisis, right? And industries that are being affected by this encompass a lot of businesses who are just fighting, you know, day by day to keep their doors open. So I think that's an important perspective to have when we, you know, consider any of this and so many other things. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Leah. Michal, would you like to respond?
I wasn't quite ready there. So maybe I'm thinking these things up as I go through here. Three quick things. So first, I'm going to plug a memo I have out at the C.D. Howe Institute released today, and there's going to be a part 2 tomorrow. So the number one recommendation is kind of spelled out in that memo. So I encourage people to look at that. You can find a link on my Twitter feed or go to the C.D. Howe website. but it has to do with the decision on February 13th, the most recent or second most recent express entry draw, which I think clearly was not well advised. And so I've kind of spelled out my criticisms of that approach. The second thing I kind of feel like I have to hit head on as an economist is this notion that I'm hearing a lot about in the discourse about the need to increase immigration of low-skilled workers in order to fill these kinds of jobs people talk about that Canadians won't do. And my understanding from as an economist is that that's really misunderstands how economies work. There aren't jobs in an economy that, like an economy is not a machine that if it's missing some kind of cog, it's not going to work. Economies adjust, prices adjust. People make decisions about what occupations to go into. So if you think about something like the live-in caregiver program, you have to ask yourself, what would happen if you shut down that program? Those are what we call essential workers, but what happens if you shut that down so that those inflows of immigrants don't come in? Well, it means there's more competition for the workers who work in those fields now, which potentially raises wages, also influences people's decisions what kind of occupations they want to go into. So if you want to, be a nurse or a nurse's aide, maybe the wages are higher there. And so you get more people moving into that. Economies adjust. And some of those adjustments are they're kind of adjustments that reduce inequality because wages at the bottom end will get pressured up instead of getting pressured down. So you have to think about these kinds of effects especially when we think about temporary foreign worker programs. These are all, we got to think about what is it we're trying to achieve. And then we use the instruments, the policy levers, there are many of them in our immigration system to try and reach those objectives. The third thing I'll say is in terms of selecting, if we talk a lot about trying to, with our international student programs to attract the best and brightest, the top talent. And the reality is that small numbers of high performers at the top of the talent distribution can have huge impacts. You think about innovation and patenting and startups, you can have huge impacts on economic growth. So how do you attract those kinds of people to settle in Canada? Well, there's one huge horizontal equity problem in Canada, and that is that an international student who comes to Canada pays 3 to 4 times as much in tuition, even when they have every intention and will permanently settle in Canada. And a domestic student who has every intention of going to the United States after they graduate pays much less, a quarter, right? And so one way to do this is perhaps for the very top talent, you could have programs that provide incentives that, waive tuition premiums if they settle in Canada and work enough years. So there are ways, I think, that we can compete better with salary premiums in the US to try and attract and retain the top talent that can have these very big effects on growth, economic growth. So I think there are levers, policy levers out there that we can take advantage of.
Great, thank you, Miguel. And then Kareem, if you can weigh in on some recommendations.
I think there's a few things that we could do. Robert touched on this briefly. First, we could offer IRCC funded settlement services to international students. This is something I wanted to happen prior to the pandemic. I think it's even more important for us during and after the pandemic. IRCC's departmental budget is nearly $3 billion, of which 70% goes to settlement services. Most of the services goes towards language training and employment integration. And this is obviously the area that all newcomers need the most support in, including international students. I think a solution could be worked out in conjunction with the provinces and territories who also share responsibility on settlement services that can identify a bridge to help international students during this time. Other thing is I would look at ways of expanding international student eligibility during the pandemic. An easy solution, although I think it's very unlikely, would be to reduce the work experience requirement for the Canadian Experience class during the pandemic might not be a wise policy in terms of supporting labor market integration after the pandemic. But if IRCC again is keen on achieving the 401,000 figure, this is something that they could consider. The third thing is that we need to double down on our efforts in terms of offering employment integration supports during and after the